Hello, everyone, and welcome to Diplomatic Briefing. After the China-US talks in Geneva, Switzerland, a major joint statement was released on the afternoon of May 12th. Both countries will significantly reduce the additional tariffs imposed on each other, far exceeding outside expectations. The high-level economic and trade talks between China and the United States achieved substantial progress. CCTV's new media platform, Yuyuan Tantian, published an article titled 3 Sentences to Explain the Substantial Progress in the High-Level China-US Economic and Trade Talks. Yuyuan Tantian broke down the talks between the two sides as candid, in-depth, and constructive. Candid means that everything that needed to be discussed was discussed, in-depth means that all the important topics were covered, and constructive means that both sides felt the talks went well. The article quotes Luo Zhenxing, director of the research office at the Institute of American Economy, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, analyzing that there are 2 factors behind the substantial progress made by China and the US in such a short period of time. First, in this round of China-US economic and trade friction, due to the US imposing abnormal and excessively high tariffs on China, and China resolutely countering to protect its own interests, both sides quickly raised tariffs to prohibitive levels. As a result, the impact on both sides was immediate and obvious. The second factor is that after experiencing the previous round of China-US trade friction, both sides have become very familiar with each other's demands. Under such circumstances, the high-level China-US economic and trade talks in Switzerland achieved substantial progress. Some opinions suggest that, on the surface, since the US reduced its tariffs to 30% while China lowered its tariff to 10%, it seems as if the US has gained the upper hand. In fact, this only applies to most of the other parties' imported products. For many American products such as agricultural goods, gasoline vehicles, and natural gas, China's tariffs are actually higher than 10%. These are the main products the US exports to China, so overall, the arrangement is basically reciprocal. Subsequently, both sides continued negotiations on the fentanyl issue. In other words, Trump still needs to find a way to back down and figure out how to remove the additional 20% tariffs on China that were arbitrarily imposed because of the fentanyl issue. The China-US statement mentioned that China will take necessary measures to suspend or cancel non-tariff countermeasures against the US that began on April 2, 2025. What specific measures are included was not specified. Does this include rare earth control measures? Yonyuan Tantian released another message on Iman, stating that China has recently launched a special operation to crack down on the smuggling and illegal export of strategic minerals and will soon organize a series of further actions. Previously, medium and heavy rare earths that were subject to export controls were included in these measures. The post from Yuan Tantian also mentioned that earlier, American research institutions had expressed concerns, saying that China's rare earth controls have left the United States unable to fill the rare earth supply gap. After all, more than 90% of rare earths are currently refined and processed by China. The general interpretation is that China's rare earth export controls are still ongoing. A spokesperson for the Ministry of Commerce also responded to reporters' questions regarding the launch of a special campaign to crack down on the smuggling and illegal export of strategic minerals. The spokesperson pointed out that strengthening export controls on strategic mineral resources is a matter of national security and development interests. Since China began implementing export controls on certain strategic minerals, it has discovered that some foreign entities have colluded with domestic criminals in an attempt to evade export control measures through smuggling and other means. To curb the momentum of smuggling and related activities, the Office of the National Export Control Work Coordination Mechanism held an on-site meeting in Shenzhen, Guangdong Province on May 9th, focusing on cracking down on the smuggling of strategic minerals and made special arrangements for this effort. In the near future, a series of additional operations will be organized. All relevant departments will immediately take action, targeting recent illegal and non-compliant activities in the strategic mineral sector, such as concealing or falsely reporting dangerous goods, smuggling by hiding items, and re-exporting through third countries in attempts to evade export controls. They will promptly launch interdepartmental investigations and case discussions, intensify inspections and enforcement at border checkpoints, thoroughly uncover illegal entities and smuggling networks behind the scenes, and swiftly and strictly investigate and handle violations. These efforts will continuously enhance the effectiveness of export control law enforcement and effectively safeguard national security and development interests. To briefly summarize, China has never stated that its control over rare earths is linked to the tariff war, nor is it a countermeasure. When the policy was announced, it was not included in the same notice as those related to tariffs. Whether the controls are tightened or relaxed is determined by China itself. It can be said that this is a routine internal management measure aimed at the global market, with the core purpose of supporting China's broader resource management strategy. On the other hand, there is a focused effort to intensify the crackdown on smuggling. In the past, when China-US relations were more relaxed, certain policy measures were implemented based on mutual needs, and there were cases of smuggling or reselling of controlled products, with law enforcement not always being very strict. However, now the United States is simply too untrustworthy, and its controls on chips have become even stricter. In response, China is reciprocating by strictly controlling rare earths, the core raw materials for manufacturing chips and other high-tech products. Similarly, the series of measures taken by China are all about keeping more leverage for potential greater risks in the future. This is a result of US politicians becoming increasingly unreliable. Not only will China hold something in reserve, I believe that all major economies will do the same when negotiating with the United States. In any case, the outside world has responded positively to the outcome of the China-US negotiations. A Reuters report on the 12th stated that the talks held in Geneva were the first face-to-face meeting between Chinese and American officials since US President Trump launched the tariff war. The results of the negotiations exceeded market expectations. After the news was announced, investors' confidence in avoiding a full-scale trade war was boosted, with stock markets in Europe and Asia rising across the board, and US stock indices also surging after the opening. CNBC, the American consumer news and business channel, pointed out that after the tariff reductions, trade between China and the US is expected to recover rapidly. This would reverse the downward trend that began after Trump announced high tariffs in early April. However, analysts also believe that one should not expect the trade issues between China and the US to be easily resolved. Nevertheless, the consensus reached by both sides has eased trade tensions and created a good starting point for future engagements. Yan Shen, a senior analyst at Denmark's Sid Bank, said that this deal may be short-lived, but the results have exceeded expectations and could have a positive ripple effect on global trade, boosting demand for container shipping. A research team from the think tank, the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China, interpreted this as an outcome of the China-US tariff negotiations that exceeded everyone's expectations. They believe it is the most significant easing of tensions and breakthrough in negotiations globally since the US launched the tariff war in 2025. This reflects the sense of great power responsibility shown by the decision-makers of both China and the United States to reverse the continued deterioration of global political, economic, and trade conditions before the worst-case scenario occurs. More importantly, it signifies a rare ray of hope emerging after the shadow of the Trump 2.0 tariff war, rekindling the world's optimism for the continued advancement of globalization. The phase consensus reached in this joint statement is a tactical adjustment by both countries to recalibrate their competitive and cooperative relationship with a pragmatic approach, set against the backdrop of unprecedented changes not seen in a century and a sluggish global economic recovery. However, this outcome does not signify a substantive resolution of the structural contradictions between China and the United States, nor indicate a fundamental change in the logic of great power rivalry, and even less mean there will be no friction or serious disagreements between the two countries in the future. The current arrangement of suspending 24% of tariffs while retaining 10% as a flexible measure not only reflects the United States' practical need to address economic challenges such as rising inflation and mounting debt, but also highlights China's bottom-line thinking of safeguarding the security of its industrial supply chain while maintaining strategic resolve. Looking at the current strategic situation, China's GDP grew by 5.4% year-on-year in the first quarter, surpassing last year's national growth rate of 5%, as well as the 5.3% growth rate in the first quarter of last year, ranking among the top of the world's major economies. The United States is currently caught in a debt inflation spiral, with stubborn inflation at 3.2% and a national debt of $36.7 trillion, which has already forced the Federal Reserve into a trilemma in the process of normalizing monetary policy. The current window for negotiations happens to coincide with a critical juncture of profound adjustments in the global political and economic landscape. China's advancement of institutional opening up, while firmly upholding the bottom line of mutual respect, is not only a practical embodiment of the dialectical approach of daring to struggle, being adept at struggle and seeking cooperation through struggle, but also a timely response to the responsibilities of major powers in building a multipolar order. The Institute's report also points out that the time taken for China and the United States to reach this joint statement was significantly shorter than when the two countries issued a joint statement on bilateral economic and trade consultations in 2018, and it was also more productive. This fully demonstrates that at this stage there is at least some room for negotiation between China and the US on bilateral trade issues. The economic and trade relations between the two countries are unlikely to be completely severed. However, this unexpectedly successful round of negotiations was not something the United States could have anticipated before launching this round of the tariff war. Instead, it is a phased achievement that China attained by standing firm, refusing to compromise, and actively engaging in the tariff struggle against the US government's pressure. In the face of US containment and suppression, daring to struggle, adept at struggle, seeking cooperation through struggle, and engaging in struggle without breaking relations are long-term principles for China. Compared to 8 years ago during the Trump 1.0 era, China is now more experienced and capable in handling US entanglements. China has become more adaptable and more adept at responding to the current pace and tactics of strategic competition against China in the Trump 2.0 era. For example, in this round of the tariff standoff, China adopted a non-tariff countermeasure by imposing export controls on 7 types of medium and heavy rare earths, delivering a fatal blow to the US military-industrial sector. This demonstrated China's forward-looking and strategic approach to handling tariffs, and by combining tariff and non-tariff measures, China secured strategic room to achieve this statement. The research report also points out that the conclusion of this joint statement has temporarily eased economic and trade relations between the two countries in the short term. China's foreign trade sector can take advantage of this 90-day window of opportunity to expedite exports to the United States. At the same time, it is necessary to remind those in the investment and trade sectors to continue approaching this joint statement with caution. The contest between China and the United States is still ongoing, so do not harbor illusions or become opportunists regarding China-US relations. Given the lesson from the Trump 1.0 era, when Trump tore up the agreement just 10 days after both sides signed a joint statement, as well as Trump's increasingly emotional tendencies, there remains considerable uncertainty about the sustainability of this China-US joint statement and the subsequent economic and trade negotiations. China should be vigilant about the risk of subsequent breaches of agreement, firmly maintain its strategic countermeasures, and advance China-US negotiations and cooperation with caution. In the medium to long term, it is still necessary to view China-US relations from a long-term perspective, recognizing that there is both strategic competition and pragmatic cooperation, and to actively promote diversification in foreign trade arrangements. From the analysis by the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies, we can see that regardless of whether Trump goes back on his word or seeks peaceful coexistence with China, the Chinese side is well prepared to respond.